Class. Today I will be responding or refuting to my opponent's claim, where he claims that social media has a negative effect on the youth of America. He supports his claim with firstly being social media creates rise in depression and anxiety. Secondly, how social media harms brain development and raises gray matter development within the brain. And lastly, on how social media negatively affects social skills. My responses to his claims on why I feel like his claims weren't really that sound or some were one-sided. Firstly being social media does not cause a rise in depression and anxiety. According to Andrew Pawlowski, a psychologist at Oxford Institute with more than a decade's-year experience of studying the impact of technology, he states that social media exposure could explain for 0.36% of the covariance for depressive symptoms. That's not 36%, or that's not actually 1%, that's actually 0.36%, where it means that 99.64% of the group's depressive symptoms were not linked towards social media. My second claim towards his first is that, is stated by Carolyn Miller in the Child Minds Institute, where she states, social media has become interwoven into a fabric of contemporary adolescence. Young people rely on it heavily, social media, for communication, interaction, and for information, while conversations surrounding social media tends to veer negatively due to cyberbullying. It's worthwhile considering that it provides more positive outcomes rather than negatives. Over 68% of teenagers claim that social media provides them with support during difficult times. 66% of teenager girls agree that social media empowers them to speak out about the things that they care about, and over 83% of teenagers state that social media makes them feel more connected towards their friends. My response to his second claim on how social media harms brain development is stated by Adriana Lunsford, who is a Stanford professor who has collected over 900 freshman composition papers from 1917 to 2006. The study on she states that I often complain about our digital natives or post-internet is that the lazy pros, a tendency to use abbreviations and poor grammar, but Lunsford's research suggests that that's a myth. She discovers that there is virtually no change in the numbers of errors in the compositions of over the papers over the past century, and she has also found that in 2006, papers were 6 times longer, more thoroughly researched, and more complex than those written back then. And lastly, social media actually improves social skills, by Carolyn Miller again. Another study last year of a national sample of teens and young adults ages from 12 to 21 showed a correlation between the time spent on social media and perceived social isolation, or PSI, as the authors noted that directionality cannot be determined, that it is, do people really feel social isolated, spend more time on social media, or do more intense users develop PSI? Also, that was the same source as my opponent. And lastly, by Trayvon Robin, states that there are currently 2.8 social media users worldwide. That means over a third of the world's population is using some form of social media to communicate, making social media marketing an imperative tactic to boost leads for higher education programs. While social media is a common platform for communication, have you ever considered how significantly social media has changed the way we communicate? Statistics show that millennials are more talkative and socialize more than ever, as the socializing skills and communications have gone up more than 51% from the 1980s. And in a real life example would be how in today's world, socializing skills is a must throughout for all our routine tasks, our business ventures, and everything else. Thank you.
All right, structural stuff is pretty good at the beginning. On the first point, basically, you've got some information that suggests that it can't account for the depression or the harmful psychological effects. I thought that was a pretty good study. There's really not much explanation about how this addresses the advocates' information. What was their evidence? How does this contrast to that particular information? And I think we're missing that step in most of the argument. You then have the quote from Miller that talks about how the people who use the social media believe that it is improving their lives in some way, shape, or form. You got the teen girls, generally people feeling good about it, feeling more committed to their friendships. I think that's a pretty reasonable piece of information. The fact that later on, you say that's the same source that the advocate used. So my question is this information immediately after the information the advocate cited? Is there a context that's been left out? Why is it that this information is at such odds with whatever the advocate presented? I don't know, because you don't really make a reference to any of the advocate's own evidence. So all of your argument is basically counterclaim without engaging in the refutation. We got rebuttal arguments basically instead of including the refutation thing. The brain development issue, there's virtually no mention of the brain and gray matter. All of your evidence talks about the performance and skills of people on composition, and that's an interesting study that's been done, that there hasn't been a substantial change in the number of errors, and that the quality of work is, that it's either greater depth or there's more research or it's longer papers, although how that demonstrates that the brain is not affected or is affected either way is not clear. I guess this is supposed to be a sign that the brain is developing perfectly well with social media, or that it has been largely unaffected by social media, because that's what the inference is from the one piece of information. You need to make claims here. You're just kind of reading data and without telling us what the data means. And I think that that's the case in a lot of the third point as well, where you've got some information that you're presenting and you're reading this information to us, but you're not telling us, how am I supposed to interpret this? Does this mean that the advocate left